Hello and welcome to Ellroy Reads, and I'd like to start the show with a rather somber announcement. I have decided to cancel myself. The reason being that I've been doing this show for 9 months and have made over 30 episodes, and I have yet to feature a female writer, and that is unforgivable. But I am going to make amends today because our text for today's show is Laura by Vera Caspary. This is a classic novel, and James Ellroy's links to it run deep. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Ellroy Reads, this is the basic gist of it. Every week, I look at a book that was influential to James Ellroy, a book that inspired him to write, moved him, thrilled him, amused him, perhaps shocked him. Okay, so let's give a little bit of the backstory of Laura and Vera Caspary. Well, Vera Caspary was born in 1899 in Chicago. She was descended from Portuguese Jewish family, and she was a surprise pregnancy. Her mother was over 40. Her nearest sibling in age was 18 years older than her, and the pregnancy was actually concealed. Nevertheless, she said that because it was a surprise, she was very much spoiled in her early years. Her father was a buyer of hats for department stores, so the family had money until the father passed away suddenly. And then Vera, who at a young age, her father had plans for her to attend university, but she became a copywriter for a advertising agency, and she did this for a number of agencies, a number of companies, and she earned money this way, and she supported the family this way. But they were often on the breadline during these years, and it was this time she spent near poverty or growing up around poverty that greatly inspired her as a writer. She was very much interested in working class Chicago life, the showgirls, just the hucksters, the everybody out, to make a book or do whatever it takes to survive. But she also became interested in radical left wing causes and joined the Communist Party of the United States. She was, although she later tried to play down her beliefs for obvious reasons, she was actually quite an active and keen believer, and she traveled to the Soviet Union to see life there. And she led a fascinating life. By any means, at one point she was close to marrying an Austrian Jew who she wanted to smuggle into the United States for reasons of political asylum, but it turned out that she could barely stand the guy, and the marriage got called off due to a delay in the paperwork, which she was quite relieved about. But she was also relieved to hear that the man had later made it to the United States anyway. She did marry, and she had a very successful and happy marriage with a man called Ig Goldsmith, who became a film producer, again, of Austrian Jewish descent. And Caspary worked in Hollywood. She also wrote plays. She had a fabulously diverse career, and she was working in Hollywood when really her disenchantment with the Communist Party reached its peak. She was informed that she couldn't just leave. She couldn't quit. The only way she could leave the Communist Party is if she was to make some transgression against them, and they would bring charges against her. And she called her bluff. She tried to do that, but eventually she just kind of became extremely disillusioned with them, but kept up her belief in broadly left-wing causes, even though she was no longer calling herself a communist. The nadir of American communism, she felt, was when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, and therefore the American Communist Party's reasons for supporting America's being neutral in World War II were rendered null and void, really. And sure enough, later that year, America was at war with Germany and Japan, 1941. Okay, so it was around about that time that Vera Caspary started work on Laura, what would become her most famous novel. And it was eventually published in 1944. And it follows an ingenious structure. There are essentially three viewpoint characters. There is Waldo Lydecker, who is, a sort of kind of deranged aesthete. He's a critic, and he's madly in love with Laura of the title, but he's much older than her. He's taken on a kind of paternalistic friendship of her, and then the story begins with Laura supposedly being found dead, having been shotgunned to death with her face blown off. So the detective Mark McPherson, this is set in New York, is visiting Waldo Lydecker to find out as much as he can about Laura and hopefully solve the case. And we see Waldo Lydecker's viewpoint of McPherson, which is kind of a snobby one. He's looking down on her. Waldo knows all the right wines. He's got his apartment's full of rare antique furniture. And McPherson is a man's man, I suppose. He's a typical New Yorker, although his Scottish heritage is extremely important here. There's various references to him being very mean, very tight with his money. He's like, it's the Scotchman in me. And Waldecker says to him, haven't you ever been in love? And he says, a dame in Washington Heights got a fox fur out of me once, but apart from that. But love is very important in this text, and it's a demented and perverted love, if you will, because the characters are in love with Laura. We meet Waldo Lydecker and realize that he's been in love with Laura for years, throughout the years of their friendship, which was, even though he was supposed to be just kind of avuncular, or that she was supposed to be his muse, but he was actually really, really in love with her. McPherson begins to fall in love with her as well. And this is obviously, it crosses several lines for him because it makes him be unprofessional. First, that policemen should never, fall in love with anyone involved in an investigation. But to make it even more twisted, it's actually a dead woman. And he's going to her apartments at night and he's staring at a painting of her, which is quite striking. Almost erotic, at least by the standards of the time. And there's a reference that the painter was in love with her, but as Waldo Lydecker says, he never quite captured her. No man ever really captured her. And Laura has no photographs, frame photographs, or anything in her apartment from family. It's like the painting is the only tangible thing that exists for her. And it's seen through the male gaze because it being a somewhat kind of charged erotic painting. It's kind of a male gaze viewpoint of Laura. But there is a remarkable twist in Laura, so I'm going to give you the spoiler alert now. If you haven't read it yet and you haven't seen the very famous film, switch off now. But if you have, just keep watching. It turns out that Laura didn't die after all. Someone else was killed in her place. Laura had been engaged to a kind of southern gentleman called Shelby Carpenter, who's a bit of a rake, to be honest. He's superficially charming, but we know this guy is no good. He's not good enough to be any nice girl's husband. And he'd been seeing a woman in Laura's apartment that night, and this woman, Diane Redfern, there had been a knock at the door. Diane had opened up and she'd been shotgunned and her face had been blown off and she'd been mistaken for Laura. Shelby had fled the scene. So that's the huge twist. And the novel jumps between the three viewpoints: Laura, Waldo Lydecker, and Mark McPherson. And of those three, probably Waldo Lydecker is my favourite, partly because, and I suspect it was Vera Caspary's favourite as well, because she gives him great importance that he can see things outside of his purview. So he says things like, after McPherson left me, he went and reported this to his superiors. He's almost got like this kind of omnipresent viewpoint of the novel. And of course, he's very catty. He's got this acerbic wit. He's absolutely a delight to listen to. It's probably, many of you who know this story will have seen the film and not read the book. And if that's the case, I'd say read the book. I read it after the film, and it really enriched my viewing. It is obviously, it's just as good. The film is a masterpiece, but the book is really good too. So of the film, it was brought to the screen by the famous Austrian director Otto Preminger. He was sacked at one point from the production. It was a trouble production, but he was rehired after the director who replaced him turned out to be even more unpalatable to the studios. And it's got a fantastic cast. It's Gene Tierney as Laura, it's Dana Andrews as Mark McPherson, and it's Clifton Webb as Waldo Lydecker, and then Vincent Price as Shelby Carpenter. And all of them are really, really good. Dana Andrews is the kind of strong but silent type. Vincent Price is wonderfully funny as Shelby Carpenter. I don't think he does the southern accent so great, but he's really, really kind of a little bit slimy, but you cannot help loving him. You know, you can see why women would fall for him. There's a moment where he says, I don't know a lot about anything, but I know a little about practically everything. And you realise that that's how he plays his game. That's how he always keeps up the conversation at the dinner parties, and that's how he fits in, even though he's basically a sponger. He's living off other people and doing it with great charm. Probably the greatest performance and the most enduring performance, though, is Clifton Webb as Waldo Lydecker. And he doesn't look anything like the way Lydecker is described in this book. Lydecker is described as plump and sporting a Van Dyke beard, which is very, very striking. But this is kind of upper middle class New York we're talking about. Clifton Webb is a short man. He's a very thin man. But he nails the absolutely kind of scabrous, acerbic nature of Waldo Lydecker. Again, you don't particularly like him, but you always feel for him. You know that this man is in love with a woman that doesn't love him back, that he's in love with a woman who's too young for him. In fact, he's in love with a woman, and he's not actually that much of a sexual being in the sense of a heterosexual man. Indeed, in fact, he does come across as perhaps a little bit sexually ambiguous, but he's still very much in love with Laura. And the possible weak link, although I don't mean to sound too critical here, is Gene Tierney. I think she performs very well, but Caspary and Otto Preminger were very much at odds with Gene Tierney's performance and the interpretation of the character. Caspary envisaged Laura and wrote Laura as a woman who was very, very sexually confident and was very, very sexually natural, who had as many lovers as she had friends. Now, you can imagine in 1940s America, this is quite a controversial concept. In fact, this was still an age where sex outside of marriage was controversial. Preminger sees her as much more kind of skittish, less sure of herself, and, you know, a little bit shy and kind of much more passive to the advances of the free men around her, McPherson, Carpenter, Lydecker. She's much more of a kind of like reactive character. But nevertheless, the film comes out really well. It was a huge, huge success. Now, I know James Ellroy admires this novel. His links to it probably go deeper with the film. He admires the film greatly as well, although he has said on a couple of occasions that the film is really overrated, sorry. And he said that about a number of films. He said, even though it's a classic film noir, all of the film noirs are kind of ridiculous. They all have some kind of ridiculous plot twists and plot contrivances. Nevertheless, it features an idea that is very, very important to him, and that is the idea of falling in love with the victim, almost worshipping the victim in this case, which is what McPherson does. The victim exists in such an ideal for him. He becomes obsessed. He becomes obsessed over every little detail, every interview he can perform. This is the first half of the novel. And find out every new little detail is obviously very, very important to him, and he begins to fall in love with her. This is what happens sometimes to homicide detectives, and it's something that Ellroy has explored very much in his fiction. Think Bucky Blackheart with Black Dahlia, which was just an extension of what had happened with Ellroy. Ellroy had learned the story of the Black Dahlia and the murder of Elizabeth Short as a child, and he'd fallen in love with Elizabeth Short. it reminded him of his own mother's murder. And Ellroy's not just explored this concept in fiction, he's explored it in his GQ journalism as well, when he's written articles on Rick Jackson, or the Stephanie Gorman case, the articles of other murdered women, where he's explored the case. It doesn't even have to be a murdered woman, just the obsession, say Bill Stoner and the Cotton Club case. It's another one Ellroy has written about. But when it is a woman, that just makes it all the more kind of obsessive and all-consuming. And then you get to the very kind of twisted denouement, which is, of course, kind of preposterous, but just makes that kind of love affair all the more consummated, as if the woman turns up alive. Now, Ellroy ended up working on a remake of Laura, and I know it was very, very important to him. It was a big project. Unlike a lot of his screenwriting assignments, this was a passion project for Ellroy. This was around about 2014, 2015, and he made a number of very big decisions about how the project was going to turn out. First of all, he was setting it in London. He was going to do a big setting change. Now, I know a lot of people, particularly in Britain, get very, very pompous when British stories get remade in America with American settings. Think She-Devil or State of Play. And to be fair, some of them haven't worked out well at all. But, the idea is not that ludicrous, and no one really gets snobby when it's the other way. I mean, think of all the great classic French film noirs that were based on American novels. Shoot the Piano Player is based on an American novel. Holland Coburn has been adapted a number of times into French films. In fact, think of films like The Nanny and Bunny Lake is Missing. Those were American set stories that were made into film in Britain with great success. So the idea was very, very interesting. And really, when I read Laura and when I watch the film, it's one of the very few stories which is American, but it reminds me so much of Britain. Maybe because it's got a very upper middle class setting. And I'm not saying by any means we're all upper middle class, although in Britain that tends to be the kind of cultural side of ourselves that we export. I mean, we do make working class films by people like Ken Loach, but the chances are, if you're watching this from abroad, you're much more likely to have watched Downton Abbey than you are to have watched a kitchen sink drama, statistically speaking. Laura takes place in this very, very exclusive world in upper middle class New York. The film very much so. It was also adapted to the stage, which you can see working very successfully. There's only a couple of key settings. The only other American film, again based on a novel I can think that feels really British to me is The Age of Innocence. It has an almost 80% of the cast is British, and it feels very much like a British film. Anyway, Laura and The Age of Innocence. If you're interested in the idea of American films that feel British, those are two. If you've got any others, just pop them in the comment thread for me. Ellroy had actually been in a relationship with a British journalist for a few years, so he'd been spending time in Britain, and he'd soaked up a lot of the atmosphere. He wanted to set it in Britain and make Macpherson a Scotland Yard detective inspector. The references to Macpherson's very, very distinct British or more distinctly Scottish heritage would have been a very natural fit, although Lydecker would certainly have been an easy British character to do. His snobbery would have fit quite well, I think, in a British setting. And eventually Ellroy was working hard on the project and was talking about it quite vocally. Got ill. He came down with a kidney disease that was quite worrying at the time, and he actually took steps to avoid this being reported in the press or getting around Hollywood, because he was so devoted to this project. He didn't want any story of him getting ill torpedoing the project. Now, eventually, Ellroy got better, thank the Lord. The project fell apart anyway. Nothing to do with his period of illness, but it fell apart. As Ellroy put it to me, it fell apart the way it always does. And he said the same thing with LA Confidential too. And he felt like he'd been hoodwinked by Hollywood so many times, because there were many occasions where he'd work on a screenplay and he'd take the money and run. He wouldn't be bothered that it would never be made into a film. He'd get paid anyway. In fact, in some cases, he'd be relieved that it wasn't made into a film, With Laura, he really wanted to get the story done. He wanted the film to get made. He had a very specific idea of how he wanted to make it. He wanted to improve upon the original version, the Preminger version. He wanted to iron out some of the flaws. He wanted to honor the story that Vera Caspary had first put in her fabulous novel that had been adapted to stage and had been adapted to screen. Unfortunately, wasn't able to do that. I don't know. I mean, his screenplay exists. It's in the University of South Carolina's archive. Who knows? Maybe one day a film producer just might pick it up and they might run with it. I'd be fascinated to see it. Okay, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed my take on Laura by Vera Caspary. And if you did enjoy it, I think I'll uncancel myself and come back next week. Okay, bye-bye.